couple of months ago, the former king of Romania, yes, it used to be a kingdom until 1947, passed away. And I asked my grandma how she felt about it, knowing that she was born early enough to have experienced the kingdom's last years. Her reaction? Screw those corrupt bastards. She felt in no way attached to the royalty, and in fact hated everything and anything to do with the king and that regime. She never met the king, so where did this come from? Well, from the association between the local nobility at the time and the way they treated people working in the fields and the regime at the time. My grandma worked in the fields, her family worked in the fields. Of course, once I found out how the aristocrats treated my grandmother, a child at the time, or how even the 8-year-old daughter of some local aristocrat treated her, I understood. If you grew up in semi-poverty and suddenly some regime sweeps in, promising to help the working classes, the field hands, the factory workers just as well, you can only side with the ones promising change. It was that promise of change and its delivery that persuaded so many Romanians and people all across the world under communism, people who grew crops, worked in factories and industry where the conditions were terrible and pay was beyond crap, to the side of communists. Now we know, with the benefit of hindsight, that for every success story of communism, there is a dark side of loss of life. Whether at the expense of intellectuals and former aristocracy, or people who stood in the way of the bureaucratic machinery that grew out of communism. But the question remains, especially for someone living outside of the former Soviet bloc, why would anyone miss communism, the system that took lives and liberty that you would have heard on the news about? For one, very few people actually bought into the ideology of communism. Think about it. If you grew up on a farm or worked in horrible conditions with no running water, long work days, which was the vast majority of population in Romania, Hungary, Poland, China, almost everywhere in the communist bloc, and a regime comes in after the war, enforced or even put in place by the Soviet army, and it starts changing things, mostly to the benefit of these workers in the field or of industry labor, and anyone that may have been oppressed before, you kind of don't really care what their ideology is. Of course, not everybody experienced these changes, and even by modern day standards, it looks terrible, but by comparison to what came before, you can kind of understand why people would have appreciated these changes. My grandma went from being the hardworking girl of a peasant family in the deep countryside to a city planning specialist in a growing city. Part of it was that with a recovering economy, like that of Eastern Europe after the war, it was bound to recover almost naturally as people went back to their jobs and support the economic output. But like every power structure, communism needed to justify its existence, so this recovery was added to the list of its successes that communism experienced. Perhaps the most important reason why people miss it is their age. The people that miss it tend to be quite senior. My grandma was 17 when the king abdicated and the Communist Party took over in 1947. Her golden days were still ahead at that time. She was an adult at the height of communism. And like all of us, who perhaps haven't reached that age yet, she misses her youth more than she remembers the details and the nitty-gritty of the regime. She misses a time when she was in full control, or at least felt day to day like she was. Here's where it gets interesting. There were plenty of victims of communism. Whether it was in the Gulag system in the Soviet Union, the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward in China, or a dozen other similar initiatives all over the communist world, there were many hundreds of millions of people that were the cannon fodder of communism. So you might think, how does no one remember when men dressed in black swept away their neighbors and friends and co-workers? The answer is, drum roll, a secret police. Well, more than that, a highly repressive system that imprisoned people for sabotaging the communist effort, quote unquote, but much more often for a joke, a subtle comment that they hoped would be kept secret by their friends and co-workers. This was a system that tried its best to make what we considered private into a very public matter. They optimized the way they would pick somebody up at night so they wouldn't even fight back. The Gulag Archipelago by Nobel Prize winner Alexander Solzhenitsyn covers this far better than I could in a few short words. And this system also made it so nobody would even try to interfere or help these detained people. It developed a culture of mistrust that some people even today haven't got past. Sometimes we don't quite notice the times changing and try our best to adapt and keep going. change our routines, we move to a new place, we surround ourselves with new people, all to cope with that change. But change does happen around us, and at the height of communism, over 1 billion people lived within its confines, and they tried their very best to live day to day, go to work, take care of children, see their friends, enjoy life, no matter the system around them. Perhaps they missed that more than the system itself. As for those successful people missing it, let's not forget that a lot of the former communist cadres simply continued under a different system of government. The alternative was to kill off or exile the very people who knew how to run the country and knew how the country works. What, for the sake of revolution? And when they didn't, they had enough foreign currency or assets to live off for a long time. I think it's very important to look back at our history, regardless of what country you come from, and look really hard. Not just to figure out whether something was bad or good. Let me get this straight, I'm in no way defending the system that claimed the lives of so many, but to look at its effects, and most importantly look at how the average person felt them. The two sides of my family had very different experiences, but one also suffered before communism very differently than the other. Me, I was born many years after the fall of the Iron Curtain. All I know is what I read and heard from the people that lived behind it. The better someone's experience was, the more likely they are to miss it. If they think the present is bad, by comparison to their past, when they would run up the stairs without getting shortness of breath, then you might understand why people miss it. And you might also understand why, today, a majority of Russians, for instance, miss communism and would like it brought back. As always, I hope you found the video useful. Leave a comment down below with your opinion or experience on why people might miss communism, and a thumbs up if you liked it. Subscribe if you want more content like this, and see you next time. Ciao.